Alright, so welcome back to another review by Elaine, because I have opinions. And today I'm going to have opinions about The Wild Wood by Charles de Lint. Have you ever read a book that is so perfectly situated in time and place that it doesn't feel dated? It feels like time travel. This book had that effect on me. So, The Wild Wood is a book about a woman named Ethna, which, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that one. I'm trying, I looked it up, I don't know if I'm getting it right. But she is an artist who lives in a small cabin on the edge of a marshy wood in Canada. One day, when she's out on one of the many rambles she takes for inspiration and to get reference images, she sees something that shouldn't be there. She sees a masked woman in a brocade dress, holding a book. When Ethna looks closer, she falls into the book and sees a forest and the woman holding a child and another world. And she keeps falling deeper and deeper into this image until she manages to pull herself out. Over the next couple days, she starts seeing these small creatures, though she's not sure if they are fairies or hallucinations. She convinces herself it might all be a metaphor for a lost connection to nature or an inner struggle or something, but when one shows up in her bedroom, it's a lot harder to pretend. So this book is very 90s, and specifically early 90s, but in some subtle ways. I had a vibe I remember from my childhood. There was this time that it felt like everyone was obsessed with the notion that the deserts of the American Southwest are magic. The early 90s, everyone was all really obsessed with the idea of getting back to nature and finding the primitive inside ourselves. And yeah, that's in this book. But it's not quite as bad as the stereotype of the stockbroker disappearing into the desert on an ayahuasca trip and learning how to be a better man and therefore better at stockbroking. A lot of this book is about humans trying to reconnect with nature. But that is part of what is so 90s about it. There was this idea that we had lost our connection to nature, that it was this special thing that we had to reach out and take. Just like, take a day trip, drink tea instead of coffee, listen to a CD with nature sounds on it transposed over classical music, and you could become this intensely peaceful, wiser than modern man, hippie person. It was all, like, basically the precursor to the modern crunchy culture that we have, but back then it was seen as less of a lifestyle change and more of, you didn't have to give up all your modern amenities, become a vegan, live off the grid, and grow your own food. You just had to take a weekend trip out to the Arizona desert, or take a walk in the woods and howl at the moon. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that in the 90s, we were really just beginning to understand exactly how we had fucked up the environment as a species. And there was still this hope that we really just needed to understand it, make little changes, and we could fix everything. Turn off the water while you brush your teeth, stop using aerosol, don't litter. We'd clean up the oil spills, and congrats, we'd fixed it. There was this sense of looming responsibility mixed with this intense, unearned hope that we lost somewhere along the way. But this book sort of manages to do what a lot of media from the era failed to do. It acknowledges the hopelessness, the feeling that small changes we make will not fix anything on their own, and that we are sort of relying on the domino effect to actually change things. Okay, so one more element of this early 90s obsession with getting back to nature that I have to address, because it's involved in the book, is the faint whiff of racism on so much of it. So many of the times that you saw imagery and heard people talking about connecting to the primitive, it was tied to a shallow, reductive image of Native American culture. There's a scene from an episode of Rugrats that keeps popping into my head of when the dads all decide they need to reconnect to the primitive man inside, and they go out to the desert, sit in teepees, shirtless, wearing leather pants with fringe, war paint, and feathered headdresses. It was all really just not good. And There were a couple of moments in this book that felt like it was going towards that Native American as noble savage stereotyping. There's a man in the book, Ethna's love interest actually, named Joe, who is repeatedly described as being sort of Native American-esque. Specifically at one point he's described as part Zen master, part Native American sensibilities, part lumberjack. Because he doesn't talk much. He hangs out in the woods, he hunts, and is introspective. And it dances around the edges of reductive stereotyping. Though, interestingly enough, even though he's described as like a Native American, he's not. He's Japanese. There are no actual Native Americans in this book, which in itself is very early 90s. Just a faint flavor of Native American stereotyping without ever really exploring what that means. There's also less subtle things that make this book super 90s. There's this lovely scene where de Lint describes an outfit that almost killed me. I'm talking about zebra print legging and a teal windbreaker with geometric shapes creating a pattern across it. Like, gag me with a spoon. But overall, it didn't feel dated. And I think the reason is because the vintage clothes were just that. Clothes. The inner core of the book is still very timely. This book is about the art of creation, about people struggling with being part of nature yet somehow separated from it, about loss, about isolation, and about climate change. And it looks like none of those themes are going to lose relevance anytime soon. I will say some of the climate change themes were laid on a bit too thick, but that might be just because anything that references nature in modern media, we sort of assume will be climate change related, so we don't need to lay it out explicitly. Also, this book is as tightly bound to place as it is time. De Lint does a stunning job of making two wildly different environments feel so real. I kept wanting to put down my book and go wander in the woods. Arizona was painted beautifully, partially because my childhood seemed overpopulated with people obsessed with the mystique of the desert. I never really saw as much of the draw of a desert landscape, but this book painted the landscape and the emotions it provoked in how did we pronounce her name? Oh god. What was it? Ethna? So well, I felt like I was there. And the Canadian forest made me want to go climb trees. This is another book without much action, but with a lot of introspection. But there was enough action that I didn't feel like it was lacking. And by action, I mean action, but also action. But don't worry, nothing explicit. It also felt like this was a full story. I was a bit annoyed when I reached the middle of the book and realized that it was going to be a book about a woman having / failing to have a baby, but that's a personal thing. I just get a bit annoyed by how many books that center adult women feel the need to focus on the ability or inability to have kids. And largely I hate that because I have no desire to have kids, and so I'm not super excited to see another female character whose arc seems entirely centered on her ovaries. But the question of fertility was tightly woven enough into the fertility of nature that the themes worked in parallel, and overall I felt it worked. It was a beautiful book. It was a time capsule of a certain time and place, but reading it felt more nostalgic than dated. It was a climate change book, but it wasn't preachy. And it was a lovely book about fairies.